Hello! In this video, I'm going to give my view of the nature of arguments. It's important to start here because some people have rather pessimistic views about what arguments can actually do. As an example of such a view, I'm going to lay out my understanding of Graham Oppy's view of the nature of arguments to compare his pessimism about arguments to my non-pessimism. And please note this is my understanding of his view, which could be somewhat off. Okay, so here's his pessimistic view of arguments. Philosophers worth their salt are going to have a theory of the fundamental nature of reality. This theory is going to be a set of propositions about the way the world is. And these propositions that form their theory are going to logically entail the truth of other propositions. The way theory is being defined here, these propositions entailed from their theory will also count as being included within that same theory. Now, what an argument means in this context is simply a set of propositions, the premises, that logically entail another proposition, the conclusion. What any philosopher is going to do when presented with an argument is see if the premises show up within their theory. If they don't, then they can simply reject the argument because they're in no way committed to those premises. If they do accept all the premises, then the conclusion is also already a part of their theory, so they already accept it. So, arguments can in no way change a philosopher's mind about their theory. Of course, there will be times when philosophers can be shown that their theories entail something that they didn't see before, and they might not like that particular entailment, or it's even a contradiction. But as long as the philosopher is sufficiently reflective, they could just tweak their theory, and they won't ever be forced to totally rework it or throw it out. So, as Oppy sees it, we should ditch all this talk of arguments altogether and instead focus on theories. What theory is the best one and has the most theoretical virtues? That might be the sort of mindset that leads one to reject the use of all apologetics arguments in general. I think this is a respectable approach, but I disagree with it. The way I see it, arguments do serve an important role, because my view of arguments, in a nutshell, is a form of Bayesianism where intuitions establish prior probabilities, or count as evidence, and arguments can serve to rouse those intuitions from their slumber. Now, I'm going to spend the rest of this video unpacking what that little nutshell actually means. Let's start with going through what Bayesianism is. Firstly, we humans not only have beliefs, but we have degrees of belief as well. Consider the following two propositions. 2 plus 2 equals 4, and it will be sunny tomorrow. I happen to believe both of these, but I am much more confident that 2 plus 2 equals 4. These degrees of confidence that we have are called credences. Now, philosophers like to model credences as numbers between 0 and 1. If you have a credence of 1 in a proposition, then you are absolutely certain that it is true. If you have a credence of 0 in a proposition, then you are absolutely certain that it is false. If your credence is 0.5, then you're in the middle, and as far as you could tell, the proposition's truth and falsehood are equally probable. Now, Bayesianism, as I'm using the word here, is the view that our credences ought to follow the axioms of probability. What are the axioms of probability? Well, mathematicians have labored long and hard to formalize the way probability works with math. And lo and behold, they have succeeded. We have probability theory, which tells us the rules that probabilities always follow. And this has been amazingly successful in countless real-world applications. It also gives us useful tools like how to update probabilities based off of new information. So, the Bayesian says, hey, let's take all these cool tools from probability theory and apply them to our credences. If probabilities need to follow certain laws, our credences should as well. The laws that probabilities must follow, if you're curious, are: probabilities must be numbers in between 0 and 1, the probability of propositions that must be true, like logical or mathematical truths, must be 1, and if both x and y cannot be simultaneously true, then the probability of x or y being true is the probability of x being true plus the probability of y being true. Okay, so to be rational according to Bayesianism, we need to make sure our credences follow all those rules as well. What does that look like in practice? Well, some of the implications are really straightforward. Like, if you have a credence of 0.8 of x being true, you can't have a credence of 0.8 of x being false. Your credence in x being false would have to be 0.2. You can work that out from those initial 3 laws. Here's another one. If your credence in x's truth is 0.8, your credence in both x and y being true can never be bigger than 0.8. All of that is simple enough, and intuitively, that seems like exactly the sort of behavior we would expect from a perfectly rational person. No perfectly rational person would be confident that a proposition was true while simultaneously being confident that it was false, or be more confident in a conjunction of propositions than the conjuncts, and so on. So it seems like Bayesianism does a very good job of prescribing the rational way to order and manage one's credences. Also, I won't get into this too deeply, but there's something called the Dutch book theorem that proves that unless your credences do follow the axioms of probability, it is mathematically guaranteed that someone could swindle you out of your money. Bayesians make a very big fuss about this. As they should, it's very impressive. The idea is that your credences should dictate what quantities of money you'd be willing to gamble on a given proposition's truth. If you're more confident in something, you'd be more willing to bet money that it's true. And if your credences don't follow the rules of probability, you'd be willing to make inconsistent bets that always lose you money. So, for those keeping score, 3 of the reasons why I really like Bayesianism are the success of probability theory, the intuitiveness of Bayesianism's central claims, and the Dutch book theorem. That's all very interesting, but the part of Bayesianism that I want to focus on is what it has to say about how to update your credences. This is why we're talking about Bayesianism. I think that what it says about how to update one's credences gives us the correct framework for analyzing arguments. Usually, the way Bayesianism tells you to update your credences is explained in a really technical, mathematical way. I think that such an explanation is more complicated than it needs to be, because if you explain all of it visually with a method I call scribble stretching, it's actually quite easy to understand and straightforward. So let's do that. Because probabilities are all numbers between 0 and 1, we could visualize them as sections of a square that has itself a total area of 1. So, a fair coin toss can be visualized like this. 50% of the area of the square represents the proposition the coin will land on heads, and 50% of the area of the square represents the proposition the coin will land on tails. Each of these sections have a total area of 0.5 corresponding to the probability of these propositions. Because these can't both be true, they don't overlap. Here's another visualization. Imagine we have 2 fair coin tosses, toss A and toss B. Well, we split the sample space, which is a fancy name for the entire contents of the square, into 2 sections for coin A, and we split it again for coin B, with a total of 4 sections, each with an area of 0.25 corresponding to the possible final states of the 2 coins. Now we can look at scribble stretching in action. Imagine we do these coin tosses, and coin A lands first on heads. Well, now we know that half of the sample space, where coin A lands on tails, is impossible. So we could just scribble that part out. But now, we don't have a square anymore. That makes me sad. I like squares. My entire channel is based around squares. Well, no worries. We could just stretch what's left of the sample space until we get a square again. What's interesting is that now the 2 events each have a probability of 0.5. That's really cool. The probability of, for example, both coins landing heads started out at 0.25, but when we got new information, namely coin A landing on heads, this probability jumped from 0.25 to 0.5. That's what scribble stretching is all about, getting new information and then using it to update probabilities. Here's another example of Bayesian updating / scribble stretching. Say I roll a fair dice, so the probability of getting any particular number is 1/6, or 0.16666 recurring. Now, I don't show you what number was rolled, but I do tell you that it was an even number. Well, then the section of the sample space where a 1, 3, or 5 was rolled gets scribbled out, assuming you trust me. So, we stretch the rest of the sample space, and now rolling a 2, 4, or 6 all have a probability of 1/3, or 0.3333 recurring. The prior probability was 1/6. but after new information, it got updated to a posterior probability of 1/3. If I instead just told you that the number on the dice was greater than 2, then rolling a 3, 4, 5, or 6 would each have a posterior probability of 0.25. You can probably get a feel for how all of this works. You divvy out the probabilities, get new information, scribble out what's been made impossible by this new information, and then stretch everything else evenly so you get a square once again. Now, the way that Bayesianism tells you to update your credences regarding particular theories and worldviews works much the same way. Say we have worldviews A and B. Worldview A strongly predicts that proposition X is true, and worldview B strongly predicts that proposition X is false. The way one visually portrays worldview A as predicting X is that within a large portion of A, X is true, and vice versa goes for worldview B. Now, say we then find out that X is in fact true, and so we scribble out the portion of the sample space where X is false. We've scribbled out some section of A, but we've scribbled out way more of B. So when we stretch the leftover sample space out to make a square once again, A will have grown a lot more than B. This is what a Bayesian would mean by X being evidence for A over B. So my job as an apologist is to just find out what true propositions Christianity predicts better than rival theories, and this will lead rational agents to increase their credence in Christianity. Coolio. But despite Bayesianism being so cool, it does in fact have quite a few problems. So before I start employing arguments that assume a Bayesian framework, I'm going to offer what I see as the best solutions to those problems. By far, the biggest and most famous objection to Bayesian epistemology is the problem of the priors, or the POP as the kids call it these days. What is this problem? Well, the way a rational agent should act, given Bayesianism, is that they start with all their credences following the rules of probability, and then update those credences each time that they get new information. However, Bayesianism only tells you how to do the updating part. It doesn't tell you what credences you're supposed to start with. This is similar to the limitations of logic. Logic alone cannot tell you whether the premises of an argument are true. Logic can only tell you whether a conclusion does in fact follow from a specific set of premises, or if it does not. Similarly, Bayesianism can only tell you how to update your credences in response to new information. It cannot tell you whether or not the credences you started with was a good starting place or a terrible one. As a concrete example, what should one's credence be in the proposition that dragons exist before one considers any evidence for or against this proposition? Should it be 0.7? 0.2? How would one even begin to answer, especially without being allowed to appeal to any evidence at all? With scenarios like coin tosses and rolling a dice, we're explicitly building into the scenario what the starting probabilities are, so there's no problem there. But for stuff like Christianity, naturalism, and so on, it's not clear what the square should start out looking like prior to considering any evidence. Now, there are two main schools of thought on how to get around this dilemma, and neither is all that great. The first is called objective Bayesianism. The idea is that we list out all the possible theories and distribute the sample space evenly. So if there are n different theories, the prior probability of each is 1 over n. This doesn't work all that well. Like, at all. Firstly, we don't know all possible worldviews and theories, so we can't actually do this. And there isn't a clear way to decide what counts as a theory. Like, does each denomination of Christianity get an equal slice of the pie as naturalism? Or does Christianity get a slice of the pie equal to naturalism, and then we just subdivide Christianity per each denomination? People have tried to work out all these issues with objective Bayesianism, but to no avail. You can only really use the give each theory 1 over n of the sample space answer in a very few select contexts. The other view is subjective Bayesianism. The idea here is that you could start with any prior probabilities that you want. It doesn't matter so long as they follow the axioms of probability. The idea here is that Bayesianism has a very interesting feature that has been mathematically proven. If you keep updating your credences on more and more information long enough, then your credences will approach the truth sooner or later, even if your priors were way off. It's just that the more off-base your priors were to start with, the longer it will take to get on track. Now that's pretty great, but by saying that the prior probabilities can be anything, well, that opens up some ridiculous possibilities. Like, if I decide to make the prior probability of the Earth being round 1 in a googolplex, then I could, in theory, be convinced by the evidence eventually that the Earth is round. But it would take far, far longer than my lifetime permits. So, objective Bayesianism is so rigid that it can't be used practically. And subjective Bayesianism is loose with the priors, which doesn't sound so bad at first because Bayesianism can make some allowance for that, but subjective Bayesianism is just so loose with the rules that it allows for super duper crazy stuff. Well, I think that I actually have a solution to the problem of the priors, the POP, that is more rigid than subjective Bayesianism, but is nonetheless more practical than objective Bayesianism. Here it is. Dramatic pause. The prior probability of a proposition is how intuitive the proposition is. It's important to note that intuition is one of those words philosophy nerds use slightly differently from anyone else, so please understand that by how intuitive the proposition is, I mean how strongly it seems the proposition is true before considering evidence or comparing it against one's other beliefs. This is not the same as a mere gut feeling. I'm going to name this form of Bayesianism, where prior probabilities are established by intuitions, as intuitive Bayesianism. I really like intuitive Bayesianism for 4 main reasons. First, remember when subjective Bayesianism was trying to assuage our worries about bad prior probabilities because after enough evidence everything will work out? Well, this doesn't work for super crazy prior probabilities. However, although our intuitions are by no means infallible, they do pass the bar of being not super crazy. So they work as a starting point. Intuitions are often bashed because they're too subjective, but all we need is that for them to be in the ballpark of a right answer, and then scribble stretching will get us back on track. Secondly, intuition is a faculty of our minds, and Bayesianism already relies on the faculties of our mind being somewhat reliable, so intuitive Bayesianism coheres nicely. Here's another way to put that. Critics of Bayesianism will say, Bayesianism doesn't work unless you can get prior probabilities from somewhere. My response will be, okay, well, Bayesianism also doesn't work unless I have the ability to store and recall information, because I need to remember what my credence is in a proposition. Luckily, I come pre-built, so to speak, with the mental faculty of memory, which allows me to do that, so Bayesianism is safe. But Bayesianism also doesn't work unless I have the ability to get new information about reality, otherwise I would have nothing to tell me what portions of the sample space to scribble out. Luckily, I come pre-built with faculties that allow me to perceive the external world, like eyes and ears, so Bayesianism is safe. Now you come along and tell me Bayesianism doesn't work unless I could get prior probabilities from somewhere? Well, luckily, I come pre-built with the mental faculty of intuition, which allows me to generate a prior probability whenever I hear of a new proposition. So, Bayesianism is safe. What's also cool is that mental faculties like our memory, our reason, and our sense perception are thought to get the benefit of the doubt. They're assumed to be at least somewhat reliable until proven otherwise. On intuitive Bayesianism, our intuitions enjoy this privilege as well. In the same way that we don't need to prove that we're actually experiencing the external world rather than in the matrix, one does not need to prove that one's intuition is reliable. Thirdly, I think that intuitive Bayesianism accurately reflects what generally happens in the real world. Intuitive Bayesianism says that how plausible something initially strikes us is what acts as the starting point for deciding how probable it really is. Well, that's what actually happens. If someone is told a hypothesis that seems wrong to them, they'll need more evidence than if they're told a hypothesis that seems right. This is exactly what we'd expect to see if intuition was in fact a faculty for generating prior probabilities. So, intuitive Bayesianism has empirical support. Finally, intuitive Bayesianism safeguards common sense and allows for Moorian shifts. The idea with a Moorian shift is that if there's an esoteric philosophical argument against a common sense proposition, like that we know the external world exists, it's permissible to throw out the esoteric argument and maintain the common sense. Well, intuitive Bayesianism entails that the prior probability of common sense propositions will be very, very high, as they really seem to be true. And this means that after we update the probability with a philosophical argument whose premises are not intuitive and have a low prior probability, the probability of the common sense proposition will still be very high. Anyways, as you could probably tell, I really like intuitive Bayesianism. And, returning to what I was talking about at the beginning of this video, this adherence to intuitive Bayesianism is what leads me to reject a pessimistic view of arguments, such as oppies. For, when an argument is presented to me, I don't just get to reject, or even remain agnostic towards some premises, on the grounds that it isn't entailed by my preferred theory of reality. Rather, each new argument has the ability to rouse a new intuition from its slumber, or can call on some other sort of evidence which will rationally require some scribble stretching, and a subsequent change to my credences. In fact, any argument with premises that have any intuitiveness at all will require an update to one's credences, even if it's a tiny change. Updating your credence based on an argument shouldn't be a rare occurrence that only happens when you find that your theory entails a contradiction or something. Updating your credences based on a new argument should be the norm. So if somebody has very different intuitions from you, it may take a ton of arguments and evidence to change their mind, but it's still theoretically possible to do as long as the evidence is actually on your side. So, with that said, I think that this video should give you a good understanding of the core of my epistemology, at least when it comes to analyzing arguments. Moving forward, this epistemology will give me two tools that I will be using a lot in such analyses. The first tool is scribble stretching as a method of constructing arguments. Rather than giving deductive syllogisms, I'm going to instead paint a picture of what the sample space looks like, noting what theories predict which pieces of evidence, and then argue that the probability of theism is consistently raised by the evidence we have. The second tool is intuition as a form of evidence. Given my epistemology, it is perfectly legitimate to appeal to some proposition which seems true, and then draw out philosophical implications from it. What's interesting is that these two tools are already widely used in philosophy, but I don't want to take anything for granted. Anyways, despite having these cool tools for formulating arguments, it would be premature to jump into formulating arguments just yet. Bayesian epistemology has a bunch more objections that I have yet to explore, and I want to take a look at them. So that's what we'll do in the next video. See you there!